it's really the VAB. It's the VAB concept of you really have to know where your biases are before you can truly validate and affirm someone. I think the part of the being a self-reflection for me is the most important part. And frankly, those folks who tend to be more self-reflective tend to be more culture responsive. So I think it's an underrated variable that we really don't talk about or even train on. It's just the art of reflection. So for me, I would say that that initial self-reflection around why do I see this behavior in a negative way, which is the bias part, where's that coming from? That then leads to validation affirmation. That would be the single most important thing. VAP stands for validate, affirm, build, and bridge. To validate means to make legitimate those cultural and linguistic behaviors that have been made illegitimate in a historic or institutional way, or through the media, mainstream media, social media. And affirm means to make positive, in most cases, images and representations of certain cultures and languages that have been marginalized through institutional knowledge and mainstream media. And the BB simply means that we're going to build on the cultural assets and linguistic assets that students are bringing to school so that we can bridge them towards academic and mainstream success if they choose that route. So it's validate, affirm, build, and bridge, and we call it VAB for short. I think for me, I'm trying to give you an example without the chronology, because the way I normally define it, it weaves them with a story. So you're asking me for the definition, and then now an example. So the example I'm going to give would be that you have a student who comes in the classroom in what would be considered a rambunctious, disruptive way, which is actually tied to a cultural behavior such as cultural greeting that is really more related to the student's age, gender, and ethnic identity. And the greeting, his way of greeting is important to him, but in the context of school, it's seen as a negative. So the validate affirm means, how do I connect with this student around a behavior that has been delegitimized? And I do that by validating and affirming him, saying something, doing something, or thinking differently in a way that's not punitive, consequential, or a reprimand. And at the same time, I want the student to be reflective about what is the culturally appropriate way to greet in the context of school culture or whatever culture, business culture. And I'm wanting that student to practice that situational appropriateness going forward. The first thing is the school has to adapt to the kids' culture. And that adaptation is really about a validation affirmation around a behavior that, this is the key point, that has been historically seen as negative, wrong, unacceptable. That's the key part. So that's where the change in school, that's the change for the school culture, which people don't want to acknowledge, who are trying to twist the information. So the fact that the school is willing to validate and affirm these traditionally marginalized behaviors is a change for a school. At the same time, we want students to be able to adapt to whatever the cultural situation is. It's really not about school, it's about in a professional setting in terms of job. It's about when you're with family, right? So it's really, the definition in its purest form is, what is the most appropriate cultural and linguistic behavior for the situation, right? That's really what it is. And the student or the learner has to make that determination and hopefully have the skill set to perform the culture, perform the language. The big difference that's not acknowledged here is, though, we're saying as school in particular, you have to be validated and affirmed. That is what enables a buy-in to the adaptation at school. Without the validation affirmation, then it's not considered valid. It's not considered cultural in terms of its responsiveness. The difference between race and culture is best explained by looking at a situation that is racially homogeneous, right? So we can point to some maybe West African countries, some maybe Asian countries that are pretty much racially homogeneous, and then talk about what makes them different. And when you begin to talk about those differences, now you're talking about culture. And that best explains the difference between race and culture. Race is how do I want to put this? Race is story of human geography. That's all I was looking for. It's a story of human geography. It simply tells a story of how humans have walked around the world, but it doesn't tell you anything about them in terms of their cultural dynamics as they walked around the world. Race is something that has been used to disenfranchise folks, enslave folks, right? So we know in that context, that's the social construction of it, to be used against folks. Where I think that's the case with culture as well, but we don't recognize it as that because it's conflated with race. So we try to get teachers to divide the behaviors into three categories: culturally inappropriate, unacceptable, and egregious. And so a behavioral concern would go under the second two columns, right? Unacceptable or egregious. Once again, probably related to safety of students and the others, or some sort of blatant, obvious kind of disrespect. So for us, it's really about understanding the categories of cultural behavior, such as sociocentrism, conversational patterns. That then helps us distinguish between behavioral concerns and when things are culturally inappropriate, right? And a lot of behavioral concerns then won't fall under those cultural behaviors. It'll be in other categories. Like egregious would be egregious behavior would be setting off the fire alarm in the school. So that clearly has nothing to do with culture. So I think that's behavioral concerns tend to be outside the realm of culture. Not all the time, but tend to be. So you determine what's a cultural behavior versus what I call an unacceptable behavior. Is the cultural behavior is based on some type of anthropological definition or research that we can then tie to an identity. The unacceptable behavior first may not have that research context, and secondly brings in typically some issue of harm, safety that is detrimental to the overall situation. So one example I'll use that comes up all the time is with boys, you tend to get a lot of horse playing, play fighting, which we could attribute to culture, particularly boy culture. Sometimes though that horse fighting turns serious, and then all of a sudden 2 boys who were playing at first are now fighting. Once they begin fighting, now that becomes unacceptable. So I look at it as a line. There's a line between what's cultural and unacceptable where you can cross. The point here is that we don't want educators misconstruing horse playing as unacceptable. right? Because it's really more akin to boys being boys, quote unquote. So we want to acknowledge that. We want to validate and affirm that, with the thought that they would be more culturally appropriate and actually not horseplay, which then obviously prevents getting too unacceptable in the first place. But it's how we go at them initially, right? So if I see two boys engaging, I say, hey, stop that horseplaying. First thing I get from them is or stop that fighting. They're gonna say, we're just playing, right? And that's the part that I want to be better acknowledged. I'll give you another example with the whole notion of students interjecting during the course of a lesson, which most people call blurting out, right? Well, this is something that we know is cultural due to verbal overlap, due to spontaneity, and that it's a form of students amening what's going on in the classroom. It's actually a form of call and response. Well, that's culturally inappropriate if a lecture is occurring, if directions are being given, but it's not wrong, it's not unacceptable. So we want to be able to make those types of distinctions, so then we're clearly focused on what we're going to validate and affirm, and then what we're going to be more classroom management oriented with, which would be those unacceptable behaviors. Yeah, situational appropriateness is the concept of determining it's the concept of a student determining what is the most appropriate cultural linguistic behavior for the situation. And doing so without losing your cultural base or your linguistic base. So you don't have to give up anything. It's additive. It's an additive approach. And so ideally, anybody could walk in any situation, make a determination of what's culturally appropriate for that situation, and then be able, from a skill standpoint, be able to go into that quote unquote appropriation. And the same thing happens linguistically, which I think is a more black and white example, if you will, because I'll speak for myself. I go in a lot of situations where I'm not linguistically capable to be appropriate because I don't know the language, right? So you have to apply that same concept to culture and think of all the different, just in the everyday walk of life, how we kind of walk into stores and restaurants. We immediately adapt to those situations based on what's culturally required, but you have to have the skill set to do that. This process is about giving students that skill set. So they literally would be able to walk anywhere and know tone of voice, eye contact, proximity, so on and so forth, without them having to feel like they have to compromise who they are internally. Situational appropriateness conceptually is not the same thing as code switching, because the history of code switching is seen to be a negative connotation, because you do have to give up what you're bringing, and there is an assumption of one being better than the other, right? One language, one culture being better than the other. So I rarely use the term code switching for that reason. Situational appropriateness is different because it levels the playing field. Each cultural behavior is equivalent to the behavior that you are being appropriate to, and the behavior that you're coming from your own. They're on level playing field. And secondly, you're not asked to give up anything, right? You're actually asked to maintain or even sustain what you're bringing, because I call it a temporary. It's almost like it's just temporary. So I don't recommend the use of code switching. That's why I use the term situational appropriateness. But it's certainly more thrifty to be able to use code switching. So I tell folks, as long as we're understanding the concept of code switching, then I don't mind people using it. But it should not be used from what I consider the old way of looking at it. The difference between multicultural education and CLR is multicultural education tends to be more superficial, food, clothes, art, music, and seems to be more of a survey of a variety of cultures, right? Whereas CLR is meant to be deep, not surface. So this is way beyond food, dress, music, art, and it is particularly focused around, again, cultures that have been historically marginalized in terms of those cultural linguistic behaviors. So that's the starting place for the work within the context of a school or classroom. What are the cultures or languages that we need to be more sensitive to, more vabbing, if you will? That's where CLR comes in. Whereas multicultural education, it would kind of come in and give a survey of all the different cultures and what food, what holidays, things like that. I mean, certainly they're the same in sense of sensitivity and we need to be more inclusive, no doubt about that. But some people would say that CLR is the daughter of multiculturalism. In essence, it's sort of like the next generation. Culture responsive teaching is just good teaching, and I don't think that I think that's a false divide in terms of saying it's just good teaching. Of course it is. That's not the issue. The issue is why. What I normally say is, yes, it is, and if it is, why isn't it happening with all kids? Right? So call it whatever you want to call it. The point is, all students are not being taught equitably in a way that speaks to who they are culturally and linguistically. So CRP is good teaching that should occur, therefore, with all students. And the issue is not if it's good teaching or not. The issue is, why aren't we doing it for all kids? CRP is for all students. It's a universal approach. And it benefits all students just based on the definition of situational appropriateness, right? Because that type of teaching is happening implicitly anyway, right? It's the hidden curriculum. So it's for all students. Why then do students of color come into the picture? It's an easy answer, because they're the ones who are most likely to be underserved. It's that simple. So the reason why we end up talking about African Nova Scotian kids is because when you look at the data, when you look at the outcomes, they're the most likely to be underserved. And the same thing with the indigenous populations. So that's how they enter into the conversation. That's not how the conversation starts. And that would be the case for any situation. We're gonna ask, who is most likely to be underserved in this situation? That's who we then need to validate and affirm. Unfortunately, in our society, most times, it's Black and brown students, right? But that speaks more to the systemic element of this than it does to cultural responsiveness is for this certain group or that certain group. I see it as a form of a twist on one level, as to say, for some groups, we don't need this, when actually you do, right? If you understand it at the deepest level. Historically marginalized is that throughout history, certain student populations have not fared well in the education system. And the reason why they have not fared well is tied to what I would call, I'm trying to pull in what I would call a disenfranchisement around how they were treated upon even entering the schools. So that's why it goes all the way back to the beginning, right? And obviously the indigenous people, they have what some people argue is the most compelling case of that in terms of how they were treated by not trying, but in some cases, getting rid of their cultures, right? I think for Africans, it's a little more, it's just as compelling, but in a different way, right? Because on the surface, it may not look as explicit, but still, I call it a slow death for students of African ancestry. So we say historically marginalized, we're speaking to that long-term disservice to these communities when in a lot of places where in society, education is the key to upward mobility. So you are locked, the key that you need is thrown away, so there's no way you can get through that door. And that's the reference to historic marginalized. It's those communities where that key has been thrown away. And we're still trying to open the door. The bottom line is the idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps has worked for some, which I acknowledge, but it has not worked for most. And when you bootstrap, you know, we learn that it's really condescending to say to someone, I did it this way, how come you can't do it that way, right? And that a lot of times the people we're talking to, they haven't even been given the opportunity really to position themselves to do what we're asking them to do, right? As in my sessions, I say they don't even have boots. So the pull yourselves up by your bootstrap mentality simply doesn't work for everyone. That's really the point. And for those that it doesn't work for, we have to find another way, and that other way is cultural responsiveness, which is going to where they are. It's not saying come to me, it's saying I'm gonna meet you where you are. So when principals do their walkthroughs, we have a very specific sort of feedback form we use. The first thing we look at is levels of engagement, classroom management style, and then what's being taught, right? Just to make sure something's going on there. So that's the first thing, we call them first impressions. The second impressions revolves around the particular use of the CLR activities that we actually just do like check marks with. So anytime the teacher does a call and response, anytime the teacher does response protocol, movement activity, we just simply write it down. We may provide some tips, suggestions. Then we try to get at the strategy, meaning if the teacher used a certain response protocol, why did he or she do it? And depending on the quantity and quality of the use of the activities, we infuse teachers in at a certain level with emerger kind of being, they're dabbling but not really doing it, to all the way to they're doing it at a high functioning level, which we call kickers. So for me, any type of walkthrough would involve those three things. It would involve looking at the basics, then looking particularly for the CLR use and the quality of that use. And that's what we want principals to do when they walk through. So deficit mindset is really a position that says something is wrong with the student. Something's lacking, something's missing, something's bad. That's the initial premise, which in effect disallows for any type of responsiveness, because we're always starting at a negative, right? So what we're trying to do is get people to recognize how and when they're being deficit oriented, so then they can have a mindset shift to be more culture responsive. I think that deficit also blames the student in the context of the whole sociology of blaming the victim, right? It's in effect, it's like something is always wrong with the student, which is never about what's happening with me and changes I can make or what I can do different. That's how I look at the deficit perspective. So an example of discussion protocol is really, it's any type of structured conversation that requires a certain format and usually a certain time frame, where students, though, get to engage with one another. A common discussion protocol that's simple, quick, and easy, I think pretty much everybody's using is turn and talk, right? It would be turn to your neighbor. So that's a simple discussion protocol. A more complex one would be something like put your 2 cents in, where students are given chips or coins, right? And they ensue a discussion. And basically, when you want to contribute to the discussion, you throw in a chip. And the goal is you have to use your 2 chips or your 2 coins during the course of the conversation. So that would be a little more complex there. So we use discussion protocols because they, number one, increase the energy, the flow in the classroom, therefore the student engagement. Number two is it's student-centered because a lot of times the teacher is not even, an active part of the conversation. Teachers definitely playing a role of facilitator. Number three, it holds everyone accountable to the information in terms of participating, which then is going to get us to the engagement. And I would say, if all those things line up, it will deepen understanding about and clarity about the content. So whatever they're talking about, they're going to come away with a better understanding, better clarity about the content. I do think that students should be told the history of call and response in the context of, let's say, Black culture and, of course, the Black church. But it's also in a lot of spiritual services, right? So my concern is I don't want to be exclusive. Like, the beauty of it is it has different meaning for different cultures. It's big in indigenous cultures as well. So I think that the teacher should explain the cultural history of call and response in a variety of cultures, so students understand that connection, absolutely. Call and response is it's a type of attention signal that all teachers need in their classroom management repertoire. Because if we're going to have our students discussing, if we're going to have them moving, we have to have effective ways to bring them back so we can keep the lesson moving. So this becomes the purpose of an attention signal, and one of those attention signals is a call and response. Call and response, from a cultural standpoint, in particular, builds on the concept that the audience is connected to the speaker, that the audience is with the speaker, that the audience is a participant in the entire dynamic. It's not a passive, it's an active. And how you signal that is through the use of call and response, right? And call and response is used in a lot of cultures of color because it sends that message of community and just unity and togetherness, rhythm, harmony. So there's like a certain beat to it, if you will. And so we promote that use of that call and response, which you can mix it up by doing song, by doing things that are culture, doing them in different languages. All of these are ways to validate and affirm the variety of cultures in the class, and at the same time be culture responsive through the use of the call and response. Now, there are other types of call and responses that I think don't get at that same meaning. I call them the fun, light. It still involves call and response, but it doesn't come with any depth. It's really just about having fun, and so we want people to use it, but understand the two different uses. Well, really, the role of praise in a culture responsive classroom kind of gets back to the call and response, where it shows a certain type of connection or engagement at that particular moment, right? And it shows support and reward for students, and certainly getting praise from my fellow classmates feels good. I think that's something that we all appreciate on one level or another. So we want to bring that into the culture responsive classroom with a lot of praise. So we do a lot of, hand clapping and high-fiving, and just to create that energy. So the reason why we want 80% involuntary, 20% voluntary is because when we have 80% involuntary, we are, number one, holding every student accountable for the information for a given time. Between the time I throw out the question or prompt to the time I call on somebody, everyone is being responsible for the information, which then is going to increase engagement and also give that message of high expectations. So I think those are three important intangibles of why we need the 80%. But you're gonna do it in a way that is fun, and that's why we promote equity sticks, randomizer, so the kids don't feel like they're being picked on because they're noticing the randomness of it. And they buy in to the concept. 20% voluntary is just to give students opportunities to volunteer their responses, not necessarily hand raise, but just give them opportunities so that they can feel like after an involuntary response protocol, they can still come back and volunteer if they want to. That's primarily how we want to use it. But as soon as we do that, though, we realize we lose probably half the class, because in any given moment, only half the class is going to respond to a voluntary response, unless you're like giving away candy or something, right? Then you get 100%. So we want to make sure we're balancing out the expectation and the level of engagement it seems that's a good number to balance it out. If the kids know 8 out of 10, then we're going to be called upon. And then when you get up into university teaching, a lot of times those classes are run through cold calls. So I think it's a good opportunity to learn how to be a student and expect, sometimes a professor may give you a cold call and you should be able to respond. Involuntary responses do create anxiety with students. We want to make sure, though, it's a healthy anxiety. You do need some anxiety in learning, but what you want to make sure is that it doesn't cause people to shut down. So this is why students can always say pass. Can you come back to me? I'll do it the next time. They always have that option to do that. Just to address that issue. And if I know a student is really, really struggling, then I'll make sure not to call on them. I mean, I would never put the student in that. I wouldn't want a student to be put in that position. But I think that it's really about making sure that they understand the concept of what we're really trying to do, which is hold everyone accountable and keep the expectations high. I expect to hear and see in a culture-responsive classroom a lot of love, right? My big thing is outrageous love. And that means that students are being told that they're loved for their cultural behaviors. They're appreciated for their cultural and linguistic behaviors that they bring to the classroom. So I expect a lot of praise, a lot of honoring, a certain flow and energy with the lesson. That's what I expect. I don't expect a lot of don't do this, don't do that, screaming and this kind of thing. Like we don't want classrooms those are not culturally responsive classrooms. And it's a lot of student voice, a lot of student-centered type work for the students. It's all about hearing the students. And the teacher's role is to praise, support, guide, facilitate. That's a culturally responsive classroom. How you get to know your students is to be an anthropologist in your classroom and understand the cultural behavioral categories. And it really becomes about a year-long sort of research project around how each of these youngsters how each of them is relating to each other, how they're communicating with each other, what are the mores and nuances that they're doing that you begin to pay attention to because you are looking at it through a cultural lens. So I see it as an ongoing thing. It doesn't happen like first 3 weeks of school. It's something that's going to be ongoing because the more you learn about your students, then the more it's going to increase more wanting to know more about them culturally and linguistically. And so I think that it's something that you have to plan on doing for the whole year, but more importantly, understanding those cultural behavior categories. So we talk about methodology boxes, and there are 3 methodology boxes that we want teachers teaching out of. The first one is the traditional box, which is teacher-centered, sort of sage on the stage. There are a lot of one-way exchanges, mainly teacher to student, and there's a higher affective filter. There tends to be more anxiety when you're in the traditional box. The responsive box is student-centered. So teacher now is more playing the role of a facilitator. More two-way exchanges versus one-way exchanges. And most times those two-way exchanges are student to student. And therefore now there's a lesser anxiety in the room because most of my time is spent with my classmates. And the third box, the culture responsive box, is in effect the same as the second box, except we're going to add in now elements of culture that will be validating and affirming to who students are. So I'll go back to the discussion protocol and the turn and talk. So when students turn to each other to talk, I know they're going to be using overlap I know they're going to be using sociocentrism. And I do the activity from a strategic standpoint because I want them to do that, because that'll feel validating and affirming to them. That's the purpose of the culture responsive box. We create a welcoming and culture responsive school environment by first and foremost showing love, in particular outrageous love, to everyone. And it sounds hokey, but it's an intangible that is a necessary ingredient. And I think it's about warmness, it's about kindness. It's not about some of the cheesy things that schools do where maybe they have sort of like these great entrances into the school and everyone's pictures up, but it lacks the love, right? So for me, the first thing is for us to say, how do we show our love to our families and our community members? And that's going to happen in a variety of ways depending on the school and the context. So I don't have a prescription list. What I have is a thought for the school or building leader to say, have we had the conversation about how does it feel if I'm Somali and I'm walking through these doors? If I'm Mexican, I'm walking through these doors. Where am I shown the love? Where am I shown the outrageous love? And I think if they will ask those questions and then answer those questions, it will give them the answer for what becomes a welcoming environment. I don't think it's about pictures and image. I think that those, I've seen those as, part of it, but without the love, they don't mean anything. And so that's why I don't push that too much. The question is, are you sending a message of outrageous love? And that's where it starts. So our goal is for all students to be successful academically. That's our goal. This is not feel-good program. We don't want people, rah-rahing just around who they are, right? In the context of school culture, we want all students to have success academically. And so CLR, for me, is it's like a prerequisite to continuity of teaching, or those things that students are going to need to pass the test or whatever. You got to set up the right sort of environment for them to want to learn. They feel safe, they can trust others, and ultimately they feel validated and affirmed. So I always follow Hattie's notion of mediated effects. And in Hattie's synthesis of the research says that there are just some things that impact achievement. And so I've always looked at culture responsiveness as one of those mediated effects. It impacts student engagement. In fact, it impacts building relationships. It impacts school and cultural climate. And all of those things impact achievement. And that's to me, that's the chronology of it. So I'm trying to help those things that help students be academically successful, right? We get all the time, well, is my child gonna, this is funny to me, is my student gonna be better reader? And I say, I hope so, but can I say because you validate and affirm him, he's gonna be a better reader? No, I cannot tell you that. But I can tell you by validating and affirming him, you're gonna create an environment that would allow you to then teach him to read, that will then enable him to be a better reader. And that's how we look at it. So the evolution of cultural responsiveness is, if you really want to study it, it really goes back to actually the late 60s, around two professors who, Remedes and Castaneda, who kind of really introduced the concept initially, that then led to the work of James Banks and the whole multicultural education movement, which then bore out many researchers, right? And I think Lansing Billings, Geneva Gay, Christine Sleeter, they're all part of that group, where you see the birth of, like I said, the birth of cultural relevancy coming out of multiculturalism. premised on before I can know someone else, I need to know myself first. And there are different branches to that tree. And so there's sort of a relevancy tree, right? Which talks about really, I would say, staying relevant to where the student is. But some would say maybe does not go far enough, which is why Geneva Gay's notion of responsiveness or being responsive, it takes it a step farther, right? In terms of actions and practicality, which is what I built on. I built mine based on it being practitioner-based. And then now you have Django Paris promoting culturally sustaining pedagogy, right? Saying that we have to really take it a step further into this issue of how do we sustain cultures when students come to school. So I think that even if you go to Lansing Billings, who sort of put it on the map, she even has writings now that talks about we need a 2.0, right? You can't do the same thing. And I see the work that I'm doing as part of that 2.0. It's the next generation, and it adds a practicality for teachers that was missing, right? It tended to be too academic, too theoretical. Not saying anything was wrong with it. It was good stuff, great stuff, in fact. But teachers still left with a sense of, what do I do now? What do I do next? And I think that myself and a couple of other folks, Zaretta Hammond out there, is really saying, okay, this is what you can do next. And so that is the representation of the evolution, right? Is that here's what you can do next. So also I think that people have moved beyond race, not again saying that race is not an important topic. It is, it has to be. But again, after we've had that conversation, now what? And again, I think CLR represents that now what, right? And how can we unfold the conversation about race into what we need to do to be culturally responsive for students?